Hi, everyone. My name is Alexandra Deschamps-Sonsino, and I'm the initiator of the Low Carbon Design Institute. And I'm probably going to have to mute this right now. We are in week 3 of a digital residency, and I'm so pleased to kick off our last day of talks, really, with some keynotes. And the first one is from Fraser Stewart. Fraser is an applied researcher at the University of Strathclyde, making clean energy work for social and economic justice around the world. Originally from a heavily deprived scheme in Forfar, I'm probably mispronouncing this, just north of Dundee in Scotland, Fraser's work focuses on bringing the benefits of low carbon technologies into low income and deprived communities to make them work against poverty and inequality, and bringing more people from those communities into policy spaces. Fraser is also a board member of Glasgow Community Energy, Glasgow's first ever community energy cooperative, which is now generating at least 2 sites across the city. And you will have seen I've been tweeting and resharing some of the campaign there. So Fraser, so welcome, and over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks very much. That was a wonderfully formal introduction. I'm not used to that. That's quite exciting, actually. Yeah, thanks for having us. I appreciate the invite, Alex, and it's great to see everyone. I'm glad you've already, it sounds like you've touched on a lot of the things that we're going to touch on in the talk. So hopefully it's a good jumping off point for a conversation that we're already in the mind of, which will be really exciting. But yeah, I'm Fraser. I'm a researcher working mostly in policy, applied policy research at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, although originally, as Alex says, I'm from Forfar up in the northeast. The work that I do is around bringing the benefits of low carbon innovations into low income deprived areas and communities and households. The talk today is going to focus on class, my experience as someone from a working class deprived background, working in the policy and research space, which I'm looking forward to chatting about afterwards. So I've given various versions of this talk over the last 6 weeks, 2 months or so, and it always leads to like a great conversation on the back of it. But I feel I've kind of honed the bump at the front of the talk to these 3 points that I want you to get out of the way before we get into the talk. Right. The first point is that everything I say, I promise I say it with love. It might feel a little close to home. For some people, it might feel a little bit like, can't be speaking about me. I promise it's not meant to be personal. It's meant to be positive, and it's meant to be constructive all the way, as we'll see in the conversation after. The second point is that I'm talking to my experience of growing up working class, growing up in poverty in Scotland. I am also a white man. I'm aware that mine is not the only experience of class, especially in the UK, but obviously around the world. I'm aware that class is made up of multiple overlapping intersectional identities, experiences, perspectives. I'm not meaning to or purporting to speak on behalf of anyone else or step on anyone else's toes. I'm simply giving my experience within the policy, the research space, and the kind of the worldview that I've developed on the back of that. So I appreciate that when we talk about the low carbon movement, the climate movement, that stands on the shoulders of multiple diverse marginalized communities around the world. I'm talking purely to my experience within the policy and the research space. The third point is that I swear. I'm going to swear. I'm not going to not swear. Sorry if that's an issue to you. It's just how I talk. Okay? Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much. Right. With that in mind, then, I think we'll get into the talk. The talk will last roughly, and I'll be honest, we're kind of powering through. I'll go off on little tangents here and there, maybe. It'll last between 15 and 20 minutes. And then after that, because we have quite a small group of people on the call, I think rather than Alex, we'd originally said maybe breakout rooms, I think we just do it. We have one big kickabout with everyone that's here. With a vision to talking about class, about representation, and about experience, and then maybe trying to pull together some action points that are applicable to all of us that we can then take away and put some work into. Sound good? Right, enough of that. So I'm Fraser. I'm an applied policy researcher at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, although I'm originally from various rough and ready council housing estates in Forfar, which is about 10 minutes north of Dundee, 40 minutes south of Aberdeen, up in the northeast of Scotland. So my work looks at how we bring the benefits of new low carbon innovations into low income, working class, marginalised households and communities. So basically, how can we make things like community energy work to bring money and jobs into deprived communities? How can we make household solar panels or retrofit schemes work to reduce energy bills for low-income families? How do we create a clean, expansive public transport network that doesn't just reduce emissions, but that connects previously excluded people to create new opportunities for leisure, employment, blah, 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 that sort of thing. You get the gist. So that's me. And it's a privilege to get to do this work and to get to do this stuff for a living within that wider sort of climate change effort. Although, if I'm being honest, I wouldn't really define myself as like a climate guy, while I obviously appreciate the urgency, the danger of the climate emergency, the need for the low carbon transition. I wouldn't consider myself a climate guy first and foremost. I'm a poverty guy. I'm a social guy. I'm an inequality guy. So climate for me isn't just this big scary thing that we have to fix, although obviously it's a fucking massive scary thing that we have to fix, but it's also a massive opportunity. So we're at a formative moment in human history where we're being forced to reimagine how we do pretty much absolutely everything, from transport to housing, land, industry, economics, energy, just about everything in between. Why not reimagine those things in a way that actively addresses some of those historic, social, and economic issues? So why not make this formative moment and these new tools that we have to address the climate emergency, make them work actively against poverty, against inequality, against injustice, not just being mindful of justice in our policy making and our research design, but actively making these things work against historic intergenerational injustices. So that's what gets me going, right? Making the biggest issue that we face on the planet today, climate emergency, work actively against poverty and against inequality. That's what motivates me the most. And it's very much the product of growing up where and how I grew up, which I'm going to tell you a little more about now. Now, I promise I won't ramble on too much. This isn't a therapy session, although with the football on tonight, I could do with a fucking therapy session just now. But I do think it's helpful to let you know where I'm from, to better understand where I'm coming from with this conversation. Like we mentioned before then, I grew up in various rough and ready council housing schemes in Forfar, outside of Dundee there. Forfar is quite a small, I was going to say, for anyone who doesn't know, none of you know, Forfar is quite a small rural town in the northeast of Scotland. That's actually, it's quite nice in a few bits, like anywhere. It's got its nice areas. My partner, who I'm still with, we went to school together. Her parents stay in like a super nice bit of Forfar. That's always where we stay when we're back visiting friends and family. It's like a little treat, a little holiday. I'm not from that bit of Forfar. Forfar, for the most part, is a fairly rough kind of area. So we grew up in some of those rougher areas, between two of the main rough areas in Forfar, to be specific. My mum was a single parent. She trained as a nurse when I was just a wee nipper. I've never known my dad, never bothered me. But obviously, not having a father meant that my mum was working extra hard. I don't actually remember her only ever having one job, right? So she worked extra hard to make sure that myself, my brother were provided for, with support from my maternal grandparents, my nan and granda. My look how working class I am credentials sort of anecdote has always been, my grandfather worked in the factory that my grandmother cleaned at nights, right? That's my, look where I'm from. So that's me, that's where I'm from. Growing up in that sort of council estate, scheme environment, and all of the wonderful things that go with it. If you grew up around a council estate in the UK, you'll know the kind of place that I mean, right? So we were always around a lot of violence, a lot of addiction, inside and outside the house, all that kind of stuff. None of this is to say, oh, boo-hoo, poor me, anything like that. Plenty have it worse than I ever did or ever will have it. But that was us. That was us. So my folks were exceptionally hardworking in the face of a whole lot of psychosocial, economic adversity, largely to support me and my wee brother, which was no mean feat, given that we were a pair of wee bastards that were always in trouble, right? More than once, we both got dropped off home in the back of a police van, but that is a story for another day, nothing to do with low carbon. In school, I was always the classic kind of, oh, he's very, very bright, but he's just fallen in with the wrong crowd. It's like, I kind of was the wrong crowd, being honest, but I was that guy in school. So it was no surprise. I had 16 before I could even get my A-levels. I was politely asked to leave school. By 17, I was unemployed, on the brew, claiming job seekers allowance and drinking just about as much as the dole check would let me from one fortnight to the next. So not exactly the classic tenure track academic, not exactly the kind of person you think might give a shit about energy, about climate, that sort of stuff, but we'll come back to that. So through various twists and turns, and a lot of my partner, who I'm still with now, booting my arse, I managed to eventually fumble my way into college through like an access course onto a political science degree at Strathclyde, won a scholarship to do my master's and my PhD, and now spend my days as a doctoral researcher in the field of energy policy, which the more I think about it in context, the more bonkers it seems to me. Anyway, safe to say, very, very long way to say that it's been quite the transition, right? Not many kids from the kind of scheme that I grew up in, end up here in these highfalutin sort of areas of climate and energy policy and research. There aren't many people in this area who sound like I sound or come from where I come from, who get to work in research and policy in general, but it feels especially sharp in the kind of climate low carbon space for a couple of reasons that I'm going to come back to in a little bit. So because of that, because there aren't many people around me who sound like me or like me at all these days, I feel really out of place a lot of the time, right? I'm giving a keynote speech at a fucking low carbon design conference. I don't know shit about low carbon design. Last week, I was in a meeting talking about COP26 with the Scottish government. If you think you know what imposter syndrome feels like, try being a wee guy from Forfar, having to apologise to the Scottish Energy Minister for using the word shite bag, not kidding on, using the word shite bag in a conversation about carbon offsetting. I promise you, hand on heart, that's a true story. So these spaces don't often feel like they're for me. And I'm sure there'll be a few of you in the audience, and I can see one or two pop up in the chat, who feel similar or come from a similar sort of place. The other side of that I find especially mad, is that the more that I try and shoehorn myself into these spaces, force myself to fit in these spaces, the more I then worry that I'm getting above myself or forgetting my roots and forgetting about where I come from. When I imagine like what my friends back home would think if they could hear me schmoozing about decarbonisation and the just transition, honestly, I cringe myself inside out. They would boo me out of the place. They would absolutely heckle me to death. So this, such a long way around to say this. So this is life, battling between these phases of feeling like a massive imposter in the field for half of the time and feeling like a fucking class traitor for the other half of the time. It's maddening. It really is maddening to feel so out of place in so many places. Like we said before, though, this is common for lots of people, especially in academia and in policy. But I do think that it can feel especially sharp in climate and low carbon circles. And I think there's a big, obvious reason for that. I think the reason for that is that climate as a whole has a pretty stark class issue. Now, I promise I say this with love, but the mainstream conversation in the UK in terms of activism, research, policy is dominated, broadly speaking, but obviously with exception, by very well-meaning, very middle-class voices, and I think that's a problem. I think it's a problem for a couple of reasons. The first is that obviously, the climate emergency isn't just happening to the middle classes, right? It affects everyone. It affects working class, low income, marginalised communities most acutely, particularly women, particularly people of colour, particularly people with disabilities. So understanding and representing those diverse experiences in climate spaces should be important for that reason alone. Bringing them into the climate conversation should be important for that reason alone. Following from that, the solutions that we design to combat the climate emergency won't just affect the already converted middle classes either, right? So if we want solutions to be fair and equitable and even prosperous for everyone, to realize the socioeconomic as well as the environmental potential, which is where I'm coming from, then we need to do better to ultimately get everyone to give a shit and get around the table, or just more people than now to give a shit and get around the table. We can't fix or avoid creating inequalities and injustices from a distance. We can't represent perspectives of people whose lives we ultimately haven't lived purely on our own terms by harvesting lived experience, etc., etc. And we certainly can't do it in this little bubble, right? Now, this obviously speaks to a much bigger conversation about voice, about representation, about justice in policy design. But again, it feels especially critical in a climate space, a climate conversation that really will impact just about everyone and everything that we do. So this is the justification for, as far as I'm concerned, for needing more voices in this discussion overall. We need to bring everyone along for the ride, or as many people as we can from those kinds of backgrounds, because the emergency and the solutions that we design aren't just impacting the already converted middle classes. And we know about these long-standing justice issues, these inequality issues that are at the heart of climate and the low carbon transition as well. Now, what I do want to make clear here is that I'm not arguing in any way that people from deprived, low-income, working-class communities, however we're defining that people from those communities need to bear the burden of individual lifestyle change, that they need to go vegan or suddenly start recycling better, and all that kind of stuff, right? People who can do that and who are mindful to do that should, but working-class, low-income groups are barely responsible for a single fucking iota of carbon in the Earth's atmosphere, right? They live sustainable lifestyles already. Again, stress that I'm speaking to my experience, UK experience, sustainable lifestyles already out of necessity, and we shouldn't expect people in those communities to carry that sort of lifestyle change burden. They aren't driving the kids to school in fucking armored tanks. They're not flying 8 times a year, not drilling for fossil fuels, right? So we shouldn't expect people with the least responsibility and the least means to be saving everyone else's arses. That's fair. I genuinely believe that. I'm open to other suggestions. But that doesn't mean that we then abandon those people in the conversation, because again, the solutions that we design affect absolutely everyone, and those solutions can't be fair, equitable, or prosperous without at least representing those perspectives in the mix, in the policy and the research spaces as well. Now, of course, the other side of this is that, and some of you might be thinking that a lot of people from these backgrounds aren't worrying about climate. They're not thinking about low carbon transitions. They don't see themselves as involved with that. That's not their primary concern, right? I know that God, even today, I'm not kept awake by surface transport emissions. My mum wasn't worrying about ocean waste, right? She was worrying about keeping a roof from 1 month to the next. So a lot of people don't have the bandwidth. For whatever reason, climate, low carbon transitions isn't their main concern. And that's totally fine. Obviously, that's totally fine. But again, that doesn't mean that we then write off a cosmically diverse, enormous mesh of people that we call the working class as being somehow singularly down and out and incapable of caring about this. Because one, that's dumb. And two, for the 10,000th time, it isn't just affecting those who already give a shit. Also, it's 2021. You'd be surprised how many people actually do give a shit about climate in this day and age if you're willing to go to them where they are and talk on their terms about it. So in essence, we need to let more people feel like this is their fight, because it is ultimately, it has to be. Although I appreciate that a lot of people simply just don't feel like it is their fight just now. That's for a few reasons. I think we talk about it. We've had a bad habit, not so much now, but a bad habit of talking about it in quite abstract scientific terms, which is necessary to a large degree. But I think for a lot of people that can be a little bit alienating. I know I've certainly felt that way. And even today, I find myself having to do a lot of digging to keep up to speed with all the new stuff that's happening, with all the tech and the science of it. Anecdotally, I know a lot of my pals and my family, when I'm back in the schemes, feel disconnected in general. But I think part of the reason that I've felt like that and that the folk around me have felt like that is that we've never actually meaningfully reached out to them or represented those voices and those experiences and those needs in the discussion. We've never really prioritized anything other than the expert middle class viewpoint in the climate conversation for the most part. We've done a lot to adopt responsibility because we know that there are inequalities there. And I believe it comes from a well-intentioned place. It comes from a good heart. But we've adopted responsibility ourselves from sort of policy, media, activism in the UK at least, often unwittingly kind of bringing up the ladder behind us in the process. So I think we ultimately need to do better to bring people from those non-typical climate backgrounds into the high-level conversation. And that starts with getting people to give a shit about it, to talking to people about it on their terms and talking about their experiences with it. I think this is the discussion that I'm looking forward to having afterwards. But I think not even just because the emergency affects everyone, and not even just for the social and the economic stuff, the stuff that motivates my work. I think we need to bring more people along because we can't really hope to mobilize the widespread political support that's necessary to pressure governments and world leaders to meet targets by doing it with purely the already converted middle classes. You need a broad coalition of voices and faces and loads of different people shouting about it and with their feet under the policy design table at every level. So the solutions need to be fair and equitable. The coalition needs to be big and broad to really achieve the bigger sort of systemic change that we need. And I think that means doing a lot more to get even a few more people from places like I'm from and plenty of others that don't often get much of a look in, to get more of those kinds of people in the conversation. The good news, I think, for all of us is that in reality, these things don't have to be difficult, insurmountable, or massively time consuming, especially when we're talking about the creative industry, which I think is kind of uniquely placed to address some of these things. We already know where the opportunities lie. We all, in my experience from having these conversations, we all say that we have the right intentions and we all want to do better on this stuff as well. So with some actual rolling up of the sleeves, I do believe that we can do better to bring more people along for the ride, to help build a richer, more vibrant, effective, prosperous, and equitable transition overall. And I want to re-emphasize that the stuff that I'm saying just now, while it's coming out of my experience, absolutely stands on the shoulders of climate justice campaigners who are already doing as much work as they can day in, day out on this around the world to make this a reality. I'm speaking again purely to the experience of why we need more people within the policy and the research design spaces from spaces that I move in Scotland and in the UK. So this is why I remain resilient, and this is why I try desperately, even though I can hear myself slipping out of it just now, try desperately to cling to my accent, even when imposter syndrome kind of washes over. I know that the accent, the perspective is important. I know that the transition, that low carbon transition, combating the climate emergency, needs different accents and different perspectives in the mix. So I'll end here by bringing us back round to Forfar again. As restrictions have been lifted, I've been spending a bit more time in Forfar, and I think it's a nice place to round the story off. So when I go back to Forfar now, visiting friends, family, all that good stuff, I notice different things. I see a few more solar panels each time. My partner, Ailey, gets extremely embarrassed by me. I can't walk past like a solar panel and not go, look, there's a solar panel. Oh my God, there's a wind turbine. Oh my God. I get way too excited about energy, right? So when I go back to Forfar with that new perspective, having been in the field for a couple of years now, I noticed the solar panels. I was back just last weekend and I saw some on an old friend's house in the scheme that I grew up in, which felt like he doesn't live there anymore, but it felt like strangely heartwarming. So I see some more panels each time. I spot a few more turbines up in the hills. And I see my friends and their lovely families, and we drink and we smoke and we laugh, and we miss the people that we can't have around anymore. But at the heart of all of that, I see a disconnect that I don't think needs to exist. A rift between exciting new technologies, the benefits of them, the low carbon future that we need, the need to tackle the climate emergency on the one hand, and people who could undoubtedly benefit from that and help that fight, I believe, on the other. But I don't think these need to be disconnected things. I think they're the opposite. I think they are new sources of power waiting to be plugged in. Thank you very much for paying attention. We got there in the end. I apologize if there was a little too much diversion, but yeah, thanks. I think because we've got like half an hour, I think we've got a good size of crowd to just kick this about, I would say.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fraser. How would you want to take questions, or how would you want to have this next step?
I don't know if you want to chair it, Alex. Just sort of farm out the question. That's fine.
I'm going to put Emma on the spot because I think that Emma's been quietly writing as we've been speaking, but probably thinking lots of things. And I thought, you might throw the first question at Fraser.
Oh my God, I've got hundreds. I mean, I relate. I was a good girl though at school, so didn't relate to that bit, I have to be honest. But I relate to everything else, really. Although a rural council estate, I don't think there's anything it was quite nice, really, comparatively. But anyway, I suppose the thing that you talked about economic justice, and that really resonated for me about when you go back home and you see the technologies. Where do you see the sort of work opportunities, or how does that, it's not just being a passive consumer of solar, for example, or having a better kind of energy system. In terms of your vision of the future, what would it look like in terms of trade skills, meaningful work, etc., for you to get your way?
I think it starts with, I think that's a great question. It starts, to me, this is where sort of, I would say that local authorities play a bigger role here, and local areas in general play a bigger role here. There's a lot of work going on in various places around Scotland where local authorities are leading the charge on bringing solar and bringing retrofit specifically, which is a bit more cost effective, generally speaking, into lower income areas, but making a conscientious effort to hire people out of those communities to do it as well. So what we've found so far, the big issue that I think we've got in Scotland, and it was a big issue that we saw across the whole UK with the Green Homes Grant as well from the other year, is that there's a disconnect between intent and training and supply. Those things haven't quite lined up in the way that they need to yet. So where I would like to see improvements and changes is first in training in those areas. So dedicated training initiatives in those areas. We're very, very big in Scotland on the whole just transition thing, which is mostly about the job side of it. So we're fortunate that that gets the lip service that it needs, but it needs to translate into action and importantly translate into funding. So training, more leadership and more powers to local authorities, I would say is a big way to make that step. And also, we need to get more people from those backgrounds into the design stage. I don't just mean consultation, right? I don't just mean harvesting people's experiences and thoughts. I mean breaking down qualification barriers that exist to hire people into a policy researcher space or whatever it might be, and valuing that experience. If you're designing a policy for a community that someone's lived in or a town that someone's lived in for all of their life, that's experience that's valuable for a job, right? So I think thinking about how we prioritize experience, qualifications to get into those spaces in the first place, but also we need a whole lot more funding into local authorities and into the training as well.
I do want to actually add that I was gripped by every word you said, and I think if you were sort of just telling us what to do, I'd just go, just give me the route map, please. So I think it was really exciting hearing you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Oh, if I'd known that, I would have put much more.
Just give me the ABCD of what to do in my own local authority, and I'm done with it.
Thanks very much, Emma. I appreciate that a lot.
Fraser, my question to you would be, can you give us some example of bad engagement practices, kind of stuff that you just look at and you think, oh my God, I can't believe they've done that? Because I think that's also an interesting way to frame for people what good looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, we have, so I get asked quite often to go in and help, specifically local authorities, but also like SMEs do some of their engagement when they're specifically around energy type stuff. Bad engagement, first bad engagement is no engagement, I would say for a start. But bad engagement is first going out to people when you've already in your head, you know what you're going to ask and you know what you expect to find. Now, from a research perspective, you should go in, it's good practice to go in with a research question that's informed by theory, by some experience, by some background reading. But too often engagement is, okay, I'm going to go out to this community, I'm going to knock on doors, I'm going to phone them up. I've got 10 questions that I've already written with a set of answers that they can then give me from that. And that's as far as this is going to go. So I think that's still, now don't get me wrong, that's still better than no engagement, but it's still completely on your own terms, whether you're the council, whether you're an academic, whether you're a creative, whatever it might be. Good engagement, I think, is a little bit easier to describe. And that is where you're letting people from the communities that you're interested in, that you want to help, not even that you want to help, that you want to support to realize the sort of future and the needs that they have, is going out with an open mind and with a blank page effectively and talking to people about what they need and what they want to see. It varies depending on where you are, depending on what community you're talking to, the scale of the policy that you're designing or the research that you're doing. But yeah, I would say bad engagement is purely on your terms. It's purely harvesting people's experiences to fit something that you're already going to do. Good engagement is letting people lead the conversation and ideally letting them sort of shape the future design of the policy or the process that you're undertaking.
Fantastic, thank you. Julie.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Fraser. I'm really annoyed that I missed the beginning of that because you're a really compelling speaker. Totally agree with Emma on that point. And I have a question. You were talking about class and talking about the creative industries, and I wonder if, like growing up in Shitsville, I didn't kind of, the arts didn't really, you know, come across my eye line. I didn't really see much. I wouldn't have been affected. And I was wondering what, you know, if we're using as artists creative work to raise awareness or advocate or inform about the climate emergency, are we connecting with the people in the projects or estates, wherever, or are we alienating? I mean, what's the, where does art sort of sit in this?
That's a big question, Julie. I was kind of hoping that you guys might be able to answer that. But I think I'm with you in that. And the first point that you raised is that I don't remember feeling it when I was there. So I've done a little bit of work with creatives in Glasgow who asked the same questions. How can we do better on this? What I find is that the intention is there. There's a consistent, we want to do better on this. We want to get out to these communities. And I do think there's a bit of a disconnect. Again, I think part of that has got to come from linking up with research, linking up with policy a little bit. These shouldn't be sort of siloed. And the perspective is much worse from our side, from policy and research, that our creatives there. That's nothing to do with us. We're doing hard stuff here. I think we can leverage each other in this in a lot of ways to get to places that we're not getting to just now. But I would say the same principles apply. Is going to communities where they are, linking up. Something that I found very, very useful in my line of work is linking up with justice campaigners, with poverty campaigners, with people who are long-term in those communities, to open up doors to people that you might normally not get to speak to or get to reach out to. I'm not in the creative industry. I don't know how much of that's going on, right? But I definitely think there's more that can be done. And I definitely I don't remember ever feeling connected. I don't remember feeling disconnected, but I don't ever remember feeling like it was for me, the creative side of stuff. So yeah, that's to be honest, Julie, that was a very long way of saying I was hoping to open that up when we talked about the breakout rooms, to open that up to the discussion for everyone to have. So if anyone else has ideas on that, then please.
I think.
Sorry, Emma, can I go to Sarah?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Fraser. I was looking forward to this talk in specific. I think one question that's stuck in my head is you specifically mentioned about how we need to speak to people in a language that they understand and ensure that the way that we talk about all these things and transition is not alienating. Do you have any examples or ideas from your own work in research on how that's possible, or any examples of such communication efforts that have been happening?
Yeah, definitely. Great question. This is another space where I think creative industries are uniquely positioned to translate these things. But a good example from our line of work is in the climate assembly work. So that's Professor Becky Willis has kind of been the lead on that, on doing the climate emergency. And I don't know if you saw it. It was on the BBC iPlayer. It was the People versus Climate. They made a documentary about the experience of the climate assemblies. And what they found with that was communicating not just the environmental, even communicating the science on clear terms is one thing. Communicating the social and economic impact and relevance is something that resonates with people far more consistently. So communicating the socioeconomic side of it, as in, what is this doing to your electricity bill? What does that mean for how you get to and from work or drop the kids off at school? That kind of thing. Talking in human terms and social terms that are understandable. The other thing that we find consistently in the climate assemblies and elsewhere is that when you talk about, I don't necessarily like using the term justice because it has different connotations, climate, energy, justice, lots of different things. But when you use that framing, as in, we can make this work to create new jobs, we can make this work to reduce your energy bills, that kind of thing, it's a real lightning rod for support for people. So using sort of plain language where possible is a great first step, trying to eliminate jargon where we can. But I would encourage you to look into how the climate assemblies went about communicating the social and the economic side of things, because when you start bringing climate together with the social and the economic, that's when I find that, at least in my experience, people start to pay a bit more attention.
Emma, back to you. Sorry to have interrupted.
No, it was so I think there's two things. So the response to Julie's kind of question a little bit, I think, in the creative side of things, I kind of think most creative people do go in with that. I say this generalizing, but I think the whole blank sheet to paper approach and creating space, you know, and listening. I'm situating, you know, there's the kind of hanging out bit, just being side by side and seeing what emerges is something I think a lot of artists and creative people who don't have a predetermined outcome take with them as practice anyway. So I think methodologies exist. It's, you know, and then it's like, how do you spark the creativity of the people, or you know, not spark it, notice it. So creating space for noticing people's energies and what they love doing is part of that really early groundwork before coming up with anything at all. So I think that's what I mostly notice in people who work in creative ways anyway, and especially if they're sort of social or participatory artists. So not kind of going, we're going to make this and what do you think of it? Yeah. It's like what are we going to do together kind of approach. And you'll still kind of look like you're the one who went to university in all of that as well, you know. So there is always that. I completely identified with the kind of like, shit, for like such a chameleon between like, I know long words, and do I use those long words or not? Do I stop doing that, or do I just use them because then people can relate, you know, say, what's that long word you've just used? Yeah. You know? So that's always a kind of issue when you're in the field, really. Going, I've got to be me. I can't not be me, and I will swear as well. But at the same time, I might use like the word pontificate, and then someone will go, what's that then? And you're like, oh, yeah. So,
but that's fine as well. That's totally fit as both ways as well. No, completely identify with that, Emma. And it's that, I think you're covering it even within research and policy. I work a lot with like engineers and people who work in industry. So switching in and out of the dialogues that you'd use in an academic space versus a creative space versus industry versus actually just being back home, like talking to my mum or talking to my mates. It's difficult. It's difficult to sort of gauge in and out. But I think it's important, and I think it's good to have that link of someone who, whether that's yourself, myself, other people with those experiences, that link of people who can do it both. It's difficult and we're struggling with it, but it's an important link there. I would also add, on the back of Julie's question, something that we do in our work. Now, I work with Glasgow Community Energy as well. So very strongly linked to community groups in Glasgow, because that's where I've lived for the last sort of 7 or 8 years. Anything that we are doing research policy wise, we go through community groups. We go through people who are already in those communities. We never sort of pitch up and tap on someone's door and say, we're here to talk to you about this. We go through people that know people in those communities that are active there. I'm a huge fanboy for community groups. I think they're the absolute lifeblood of activism. But yeah, going through community groups, I think applies creative policy research, all that stuff. I think that's always a good in to not set your agenda up and then bring people to it, but to go through the community and talk the community groups and talk about, okay, well, what's happening in the space, learn about the place, learn about the people from people who live there first, and then bring in from there. I can see, Carol, you've got your hand up there.
Yeah, thanks, Fraser. Like, it was really interesting listening to your experience, and like, yeah, very, very similar to myself, growing up in poverty, council houses and things like that, alcoholism, and yeah, lots of stuff we won't get into, but very similar in relation to that. And, you know, going to school and like being smart or good in school in any way, it was like, you for the most part, you got a hard time for that.
Yeah,
you're branded soft, or you're a branded nerd, or whatever it may be. So that environment. But I guess one angle I've been thinking a lot about recently, looking back, you know, 20 odd years or whatever, like I would have been in school with people who finished school when they were 12 or 13 years of age, you know. And there's one guy from a family in particular, like he couldn't even properly read when he left school. And I think about that, and then because now he's got a son who's coming to that age now, like in his early teens, and you kind of see that intergenerational stuff and how that kind of, you know, lack of education moves from generation to generation. But there's one aspect of it when I'm thinking a lot about this in terms of climate, obviously, and in terms of the environment, if you want to call it, and things like that. And one area that I'm really fascinated in, like this guy from this same family, like hunted for food, not as the main source of food, like, but they wouldn't have had a lot of money. And I see something like that, and like that relationship with the environment is kind of so alien to us at the moment, to a lot of us. Like how many people actually have gone out and hunted rabbits, you know? So I've been thinking about that angle, and also the fact that, like you're saying about meeting people where they are and having no, and like I want to go out and actually find out those kind of people, not those kind of people, but you know, people like that relationship with the environment or what they think about climate, or you know, maybe there's not as many places to hunt now as there were because there's more housing, there's more development. So I'd be interested to hear any thoughts around that, around literacy, climate, both normal and climate, and then the hunting angle as well might be interesting as well if you have anything.
Right. What I will say, Carl, is I identify with lots of that. I have no experience of hunting whatsoever. That's nothing to do with me. My partner, her family they used to like work estates as sort of like farmers or farm hands, stuff like that. So they could talk to that, and I find myself when they talk about it, I tend to switch off a little bit. It's also like it's a bit cruel and all that. In terms of going to people where they are and having the conversation, I find it a little bit, I don't know, I'm happy to do it, right? I love having the conversations with people, and I love going into those communities, and I think it feels a bit more genuine, right? If you have, say, an Oxford trained academic who's running a research project to hire me to go into a community in Glasgow or in Dundee to talk to them about this kind of thing, that makes sense. But also it comes a lot from, I think, people feel like people in working class communities or low income deprived, again, however we're defining it, and it's a very diverse group of people we're talking about, find it just completely alien, as if they're not just like fucking human people that will have a conversation with you if you're willing to go and have a conversation with them. I don't even like talking on these terms about it, and I know you caught yourself, Carol, as well, saying those people, but it is, I get hired to talk to those people, and I think we could all do better from going out and talking to people where they are, because they're not scary, they're right there. I always, a little slight tangent, but I always find myself getting pissed off when people say things like hard to reach communities, if you're talking about like Scotland and the UK. And that was another thing. That was another thing I got told off for in the meeting with the Scottish government last week, was they'd said, how do we get out to hard to reach communities? I said, there's no such thing as a fucking hard to reach community. You're the Scottish government. You know where everyone stays. You can just like send everyone a text if you wanted to. I'm not saying like overreach on your powers or anything like that, but the communities are there. They exist. The people have always been there. It's just that we have a bit of an insecurity to get over to actually go out and talk to them, I think, in a lot of ways. I think that's what we're struggling with. Final point is that I am desperately trying just now, and we're in fairly advanced talks with the BBC in Scotland, BBC Scotland, to get this conversation, as in out in schemes and stuff, onto the TV for a documentary ahead of COP just now. So keep an eye out for it. I'll maybe circulate it on the list or whatever if we ever do get to actually making it. But yeah, I think we need to have that conversation. I'd like for everyone to see that conversation being had, and hopefully we can get something like that off the ground.
And I just one tiny small thing, just on the point you're saying about obviously the middle class kind of dominating the space.
Mm-hmm.
Like I know even myself, like I haven't scaled any academic heights, but or not to what I wanted to have, but like I go to an awful lot of climate events and sustainability, whatever else, and the vast majority of the time, the panelists, like it takes 2 or 3 minutes to introduce the panelist, head of, you know, government advisor, head of this, and it's like the credentials, like board member, this, you know, PhD. Not that they're all great things, but I mean, when the panel is like the majority, as you're saying, kind of, you never see voices from other sides. It's always the most expert people in the space, which makes sense, and you want to hear from those people. But the vast majority, I can't even recall a time when I haven't been to an event that didn't have that full representation, like, you know, across it was just experts and academics, and yeah.
And climate sort of, you can understand it with climate, right? It demands it because there's a lot of science to it. But we're at a stage now where we know the social and economic side of it. There was an event set up, it wasn't Scottish Government, it's somebody similar, where the head of Scottish Power was one of the panelists talking about like sort of community-led action on energy and climate change. And it's like, what the fuck can you speak to about that? Like, I understand you have the credentials, but sometimes you're just shoehorning the name in when there are people who are out in spaces actively doing the work on the day-to-day that have a much better grasp on what's needed there. So yeah, totally with you on that. And I think that, again, just to sort of feed that back into what we said at the start, comes with breaking down, and I said sort of breaking down the qualification barriers for people to get into policy research spaces, but also to get onto panels, to be having these conversations. That's a bigger conversation that we're all familiar with, but for sure.
Can I ask Lucy to come in?
Hey, Fraser. Thanks. So thanks very much for that, and a great last name. I guess to the point of, you know, what you said about government saying things like hard to reach, and as somebody who's thinking about going into a local government in a participation role, I also see so much about the work being internally within that government space to shift them to thinking proactively and openly about what participation means, because they need to change hugely so to facilitate that, to do it well, and to inform policy that way. And I was just curious what your perspective is on that aspect of the work as well, and yeah, what, like, you know, where do you start with that? I mean, if the chief exec of a council is kind of bought into participation being the way to do policy, great, but yeah, I'm just curious about your perspective on that.
I think two things. That's really exciting, though, Lucy. And I'm glad to hear the conversation. I've had a few similar conversations with local councils around Scotland. The first thing I would say is bust the myth that participatory sort of policy making needs to be time consuming, or that it needs to drag on. We know how to do it now. We have researchers who have been working in this space for years and years and decades. We know how to do it. We know where the potential issues lie. We know where the inequalities are. We know where the issues with representation and voice are. So I think as much as anything, just day to day busting the myth that justice or inclusion or participation somehow needs to take more time, because we know about it already. The other side of that, I think more practically, is sort of rejigging the policy design process or the initiative design process, so that you are consulting and allowing for participation before you start the design. So often, when you started to talk about a chief executive at a council there, Lucy, so often they're going, well, I have a policy that I want to make work. How do I make it work? And then they tick the box by doing a consultation with the public or with local community groups or whatever. That's better than having nothing, but it's also coming from a perspective of, we're going to make this work. In government and policy making, obviously there needs to be some element of that. But if you're going, okay, well, we want to make district heating we want to do this across Glasgow, right? Something that they've been talking about for years. You don't start by saying, we're going to make this work in Glasgow, we're about to start installations, or we're going to make it work in X, Y, and Z blocks. We'll talk to people in those communities. You go, okay, we've got this idea for district heating. Is this something that our citizens can benefit from? Is it something that they want, that they need? Are they willing to put up with the upheaval of having whether that's move out or building in their flat, whatever it might be? So I think reshuffle the design process a bit to start with, okay, a broad policy idea that you think might work, but start with that participation, start with that consultation, and then reflect and let that inform the future sort of processes. Because again, too often consultation is just box ticking. So I think actually reflecting and letting that then shape what you do next is a solid way to go.
Cool, thank you.
Good luck with it.
Can I get Elvia to come in with your question?
Thank you. Fraser, amazing talk. I think you should consider incorporating at the end of your talk like some sort of call to action, because in the end I was like, yes, gonna do it. Yeah. So, you know, just use that, because definitely you'll get people to do stuff. So my question was about how to make the case to prioritize economic justice in government programs. So I think that, like, what I'm getting from you is, you know, this, what you were saying at the beginning of like, how do we, you know, make the opportunity or take the opportunity of addressing climate change and, you know, the necessary actions that need to happen to do that. And at the same time, you know, we put at the center inequality or addressing historical inequality. But I'm also asking this question from the perspective of someone that has worked in quite a lot of government programs in the UK. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it's fairly difficult to make the case, or I find, to make the case for central, like putting in indicators about what is the impact on this for the community. So I was wondering, like, practically, how have you seen this work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to be honest with you, Elvie, I think you might be better placed to answer it than me in a lot of ways. One thing that we've been doing up here, and that we've been working on, a small sort of consortium of us, is putting together, specifically focused on energy. So most of my research looks at energy just now, focused on energy justice. So the idea of making sure sort of the benefits, the costs are all fairly distributed, et cetera, et cetera. We've come up with like an energy justice framework that policymakers can pretty much lift and lay into their policy design process to make that one of the key metrics that they then are, whether that's, it can apply to retrofit, it can apply to solar, to heating, whatever it is that they're doing. Heat is going to be the big one for the next 10 years. That's where we really need to make some inroads. So we've designed a metric, a kind of like a toolkit, effectively, that we just hand off to policymakers and say, do it. The difficult part is explaining to them why they should do it. Why should they give a shit about justice, right? Because a lot of them will fire back, especially if you're dealing with more right-leaning, with more conservative governments. Their pushback to that will be, well, this is a moral stance, or does this make things cheaper for us? A lot of the time, it is just economically effective to do that. When you're kind of making sure that everything's shared out as it should be, when you're freeing up money for people, you can create new jobs, you can stimulate local economies, all that stuff that they love. What we're battling against just now, I guess, is the precedent in the, this is going to sound like the wankiest thing anyone's ever said, but the precedent in the language that they speak. So you know yourself, right? When you're talking to, and it feeds back to what Emma was saying, when you're talking to a government minister, you're talking to them on different terms compared to the conversation we're having now, compared to the conversation that I'm going to go away and have with my friends and family about this stuff. You're selling them on different things. So I think it's being mindful about who you're talking to, the things that are likely to get them going, doing a little bit of the background research, and just packaging and framing those things in those different ways for the different people. That's stuff that, like, we've been doing research on that for a few years now. Like, it's starting to eke its way into policy a little bit more. But I think, yeah, practically, we have the energy justice framework that I think will eventually, it won't be us that does it, but it'll eventually become like a more dedicated climate justice framework. We're fortunate in Scotland that we have a government that's sympathetic to justice. Our whole thing isn't just the net zero, it's the just transition. So we're fortunate that we're kind of pushing at an open door with the justice side of things here. UK level, it's a different story. It's a very, very different government that we're dealing with. So I think practical, basically giving policymakers toolkits, taking on the work yourself as far as possible and saying, this is how we do it. I've done it for you. It's easy. Let's do it. We know where the issues are. But also being mindful of how you frame the discussion based on who you're talking to and what benefits you're trying to sell to them. That's quite vague, but kind of get the drift, I guess. Awesome.
Amazing. I am going to just ask everyone to thank so much with a virtual clap, Fraser, for joining us today on our last day of the in our first keynote. I am so excited. I know that everyone has had, many thoughts as a result. Could you please give us, Fraser, the best way to reach you, the best way for the residents to reach out to you after this?
I'm popping it in the chat as we speak. The best place to, my email's in there, my personal email's in there, or I'm fairly active on Twitter as well, as you'll have seen if you follow the LoCDI or Alex's account. Also on Instagram, I'm happy for you to follow me anywhere, to chat anytime, to give me a message. And if anyone wants to follow this up and keep the conversation going, I'm happy to just set up a call, Zoom, phone, whatever suits you. If any of you are thinking about being up here in Scotland come COP time and that, please do give me a shout, and I'll show you all the best places for a pint in Glasgow.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Honestly,
for today.
thank you for having me. Thanks everyone for the awesome engagement and for listening and for letting me ramble on about my life story. But
Not a ramble. It was fantastic. Thank you.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to have